Hi there, my name's Claire Jones. I'm the International Economy Editor of the Financial Times, and I'm delighted to be here for another fantastic Conférence de Paris event with Canada's Minister for Export Promotion, International Trade and Economic Development, the Honourable Mary Ng. Mary, it's a delight to be interviewing you today. What brings you to Paris?
Well, Claire, thank you so very much for doing this. I'm looking forward to this conversation you and I are going to have. Before I do that, I just want to say hi to Catherine because, hi, Catherine. It's nice to see you on this side of the Atlantic and so many of the Canadians that are in the room. But of course, here we are. We're in Paris, one of the most iconic and wonderful places in the world. But I'm here, and what brings me to Paris, first and foremost, is the World Nuclear Exhibition, which I attended yesterday. And of course, we're here at the OECD, and it's terrific to be at the OECD. And we're at the Conférence de Paris. So there's lots of really terrific things that brings me to Paris. But where I started, which is yesterday at the World Nuclear Exhibition, I'm here because there's also a Canadian delegation of over 70 Canadian businesses, particularly in the nuclear energy sector, that is here. And as the Minister of Trade, it really is to be here to support and to promote these incredible Canadian businesses. For those of you in this room who don't know, Canada is a Tier 1 nuclear country. It means that we have everything from the research to the fuels to the supply chain to the processing and ultimately the delivery of nuclear energy. And we heard a lot yesterday about the renaissance of nuclear energy. And the reason for that is the really importance that we are seeing right now in the world and what we have to deal with in the world. And that is, on the one hand, fighting climate change, and the other, to provide energy security. And Canada is that country to do so. And and yesterday when I spent the time with the Canadian companies, particularly CanDo, most people certainly in that room understands Canada's history and our innovation and our leadership around CanDo technology, CanDo nuclear technology. And part of the reason for that is that Canada's technology and CanDo and nuclear technology has always been done for the purposes of peaceful energy. We never had a nuclear program that was a weapons program. So it really was for energy, but there's also life-saving medical isotopes that also come from Canada's nuclear energy. And yesterday while I was there, what was really wonderful was that Canadian champion company, Atkins Realis, they launched their new innovation for CanDo. So they call it the CanDo Monarch. And I think there was a provincial ministerial colleague of mine that coined the term "let the monarch fly," which really is about Canadian nuclear and its contribution to fighting climate change and its contribution in fighting, in providing energy security to our partners and allies around the world.
I mean, you noted there that we've got two issues at the moment. We've seen the issue of energy security rise a lot in prominence. We've also seen efforts to green the economy rise in prominence too. Now, while Canada has long been considered an energy superpower, the vast majority of those exports are in dirty energy, in fossil fuels, the sorts of energy sources that may become obsolete one day. What's the plan to ensure that Canada remains a major player in the energy industry as the world tries to green its energy supply?
Well, I would say that there's more than a plan. There is a plan, and Canada wants to be, and we are taking action to very much be a part of providing energy in a greener world. It is true that our exports largely have been fossil fuels, and that is what currently makes up the lion's share of those exports. It largely goes to the United States, our trading partner to the south. It's a very important bilateral relationship for Canada, and those exports are really important. They're really important for Canadians. They're really important for Canadian jobs. But that too is changing. I already talked about nuclear, and we're the fourth largest producer and exporter of uranium, and that is that is one part of the really important supply chain for nuclear, from research to processing to manufacturing and to the provision of energy. And unlike some of our competitors in this area, Canada is a nation that's governed by the rule of law. So that's really important. So nuclear is one area. The other area is battery power. And while battery isn't energy per se, it is. We are really a leader in battery storage. We're here at the OECD, and in the first half of this year, OECD has ranked Canada as among the top 3 foreign direct investment destinations in the world. This is the first time that has happened in a very long time. And in part, it's because Canada is building out a full ecosystem around the battery supply chain. And while it isn't an energy export in the traditional sense, let's be clear. When we think about vehicles around the world, certainly in Canada, certainly in North America, there's going to be a lot of battery-powered vehicles. There's going to be a lot of electric vehicles around the world, and Canada is very, very much a part of that. We've attracted incredible investments, and we're building out that supply chain. So I think this is crucial for Canada to be a leader with electric battery from critical minerals, which is the front end of how this supply chain begins. We have a strategy in Canada. It's called From Mining to Mobility. So it is about mining critical minerals. It is about processing them. It is about being able to be the reliable supplier to our allies and to our friends and in Canada. And it is then going to go into cars, and they are going to lower emissions and revolutionize the automobile industry. And then the final point I would make is that hydrogen. Canada is an absolute leader in hydrogen. We lead today in hydrogen and in fuel cell technology. And we have a plan to quickly ramp this up. And the reason I'm looking at my notes is because I wanted to point out the Clean Hydrogen Investment Tax Credit that's been put out there on a sliding scale. But it's a 40% tax credit, for example, for the development of green hydrogen. So it is very, very important, and is very focused on incentivizing for that development and that creation of that really important energy source. The president of the EU was just in Canada just a few days ago, and there was a wonderful company out of the east coast of Canada that is today the world leading company that is producing green hydrogen. So this is very, very exciting, and we're developing hydrogen, and we intend to export that around the world. I was a few weeks ago in Japan leading a Canadian trade mission there, and as part of Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy, very much looking at markets in Asia-Pacific, in the Indo-Pacific, as well as markets here. So this is very much about Canada continuing to be an energy provider to the world. And as I said earlier, I mean, from a country that is a democracy, and today, I think energy security is national security, and that's exactly how Canada is building out our energy supply for the future.
I mean, you noted there about the critical minerals needed for the kind of supply of electric vehicles. Could we maybe go into a little bit more depth there of what exactly does Canada have, and just to emphasize how rare is it that countries have that? We hear a lot about how China dominates the global market for many of these minerals and rare earths. What is Canada doing to really compete?
Well, first of all, we have virtually all of the minerals that are needed for batteries. The rare earth minerals and the critical minerals. So we have an abundance of supply. Canada is a mining superpower. We have incredible Canadian companies that do mining in an environmental and sustainable way with good governance. That puts us ahead. We have the Mining Association of Canada has put forward a policy, essentially, sort of a code of conduct called Towards Sustainable Mining that is not only operating in Canada, it's born out of Canada, but now many, many countries around the world have adopted the practices of Towards Sustainable Mining. But whether it is the minerals that are in Canada, to how we partner and attract investment in Canada so that we can process those minerals, to the partnership agreements that we have signed with the United States, with Japan, with the European Union, with Korea, and many other like-minded countries so that Canada can be a supplier of these important minerals and attracting investments so that we are doing this together with our allies and our friends so that we are securing a supply chain and that we make those supply chains a lot more critical into the future is very much what Canada is doing.
You mentioned throughout these remarks about the importance of being a reliable partner. Can we just unwrap where we are geopolitically and talk a little bit about the rules-based international order? It can seem as though it's crumbling at times. How important do you still think it is that trade does occur through rules such as those set by the WTO, and that we do have these processes that really helped shepherd an era of globalization, which now, in some sense, looks it's not going to totally unwind, but it does look partly under threat?
Well, I think I think throughout sort of, our chat already, the point about a rules-based international order is just so important. And as I said earlier, energy security, countries are looking at energy security as national security. And we are finding partners who are coming to Canada and companies who are looking to operate in Canada because the risk factor that they are actually calculating and pricing in includes a predictability by investing in and working in Canada. But to your question about the WTO and whether or not that continues to be important, I would say absolutely. I mean, Canada was part of founding of the WTO, and we absolutely are a defender of the international rules-based order. And while we have really good regional agreements today, Canada was the first G7 country to have a free trade agreement with every other G7 country. We have trade agreements around the world that creates the foundations for our companies to work in. I think we have somewhere in the ballpark of 15 agreements that have access to over 60% of the world's economy. Here in Europe through CETA, in the Asia-Pacific area through CPTPP, and of course in North America through the Canada-US-Mexico trade agreement. But the WTO is really important because it is the standing up of the international rules-based order for trade that everyone relies on the WTO to do that. But I would also say it with a caveat. I think it's really important that the WTO continues to be fit for purpose and therefore modernize so that it can, in fact, be that tool that we rely on for the international rules-based order. And I don't know if folks here know this, but Canada has been leading and doing a lot of the work and contributing work to reforming the WTO. I lead an initiative. It's called the Ottawa Group. It's with about 14 countries, 14 WTO members. And we look at issues that are affecting multilateral trade, whether it is how developing countries get into trade, to how to make the WTO committees work a lot better, to strengthening mechanisms like the dispute settlement mechanisms. But I'll give you a practical example of why it actually matters. During the pandemic at the beginning of 2020, there was this thing that everybody in the world was working on. It was called vaccines. And at the same time, what we saw around the world when the pandemic started was about 90 countries putting up export restrictions. And when there are 240 some odd ingredients around the world that actually require inputs into a vaccine, you can imagine what export restrictions could do, and export restrictions without notification, and how things just got mucked up, at borders. So the Ottawa Group put forward an initiative. It was called Trade and Health. And it was to learn from and put some rules around in the event of emergencies. Here's what we learned and here's what we might not want to do and how to address that. And last year at the ministerial conference, while this initiative was born out of the 14 members made up of the Ottawa Group, there's over 160 members of the WTO, and in order to get anything done at the WTO, you have to have consensus. So, born out of the Ottawa Group, working then through the members, through MC12, it went through. It became a multilateral agreement that we, as a WTO membership, agreed to. So, something that was born out of something very real, like the pandemic, and some of the processes that happen that could actually clog up trade, but really being intentional about finding some solutions that are practical and then working with your colleagues around the world in its membership. That's how you make it better. And we're very pleased that Canada takes it seriously, and we are working with our friends and allies, and indeed the countries who are part of that membership, which form around the world, developing countries, least developing countries, to developed countries like Canada.
I mean, nevertheless, we do seem to be in an environment where geopolitically, in terms of trade, there does seem to be this split between what a lot of developing countries would want and what the major advanced economies, the G7s, the G20s are talking about. You're talking to people from around the world all the time. When you're talking to people in your position, to your peers in developing economies, what do you think that it is that they really would like to see?
Well, I think it really is, how do you work with economies that are not like yours, so that there are rules on the one hand, and that there is inclusivity and participation on the other. So one of the things that we really are looking at is, how do you ensure that developing economies and countries can very much be a part of that trade, the international trade value chain, and how do we do that together? When I look at our trade agreements, and you look at something like CPTPP, where you have a spectrum of countries, you have a spectrum of countries ranging from, another G7 colleague like Japan, to others like Australia, New Zealand, but then to Brunei, or to Singapore, to Vietnam, to Malaysia. It is a cross section of countries, and while I would say that countries are in different stages of development. I mean, Vietnam's a really good example. It's an excellent trading partner to Canada. They have seen exports grown exponentially as a result of this agreement. But it's precisely because of this agreement and the inclusive nature of it, and how you actually include countries that are developing and work together, so that we are creating a trading environment that really works. And then maybe a final point I would say that is, when you talk about trade, when we talk about trade, we talk about inclusive trade. It's really important that we include all segments of our economy in trade. Small and medium-sized businesses, women-led entrepreneurs in Canada, Indigenous entrepreneurs, new immigrant entrepreneurs and businesses. How do you make sure that they are also getting the benefits of trade, and that they are participating fully in the economy, creating jobs in our communities? That's the work, and it's both the challenge, but it's also the incredible work that we get to do.
And since you became a minister, we've seen phrases such as friendshoring, deglobalization really become normalized. How, as a minister, speaking to people around the world, speaking to businesses around the world, have you seen the environment change over recent years?
I think countries and businesses are looking at where they do business. I think they are looking at countries to choose where to invest. And I would say that it isn't by accident that Canada is now among the top 3 of an investment destination, because I think that a safe democracy that can be predictable for partners is something that is part of the consideration. Maybe I'll use an example. Yesterday, when I was at the World Nuclear Exhibition, I witnessed a signing, and the signing was between Canadian company Atkins Realis and their counterpart in Romania, and it was between Canada and Romania. And it was for the refurbishing of the CANDU 1 nuclear reactor. But just a couple of months ago, Canada signed a deal with Romania to build 2 new CANDU reactors. Romania had choices. It wasn't just Canada that could be the supplier of, but it was chosen because of what I said just a little bit earlier. It allows Romania to be secure in their, in increasing their energy supply through nuclear, and doing so with a country that they've had a long history with. We've had a partnership for 46 years, so almost half a century of a partnership with Romania. But as they were looking at who they were going to choose, which company they were going to work with, which country they wanted to work with, it was Canada.
But nevertheless, I think when us at the Financial Times, when my colleagues are interviewing businesses, they're all saying this. They're all saying like security matters. We need to get away from a just-in-time world to one where we do have, a surplus at times, especially for essential items. We've all learned our lesson from the pandemic. We've seen, the war in Ukraine. We do have to factor in geopolitics. But when push comes to shove, this is quite expensive. And it can be very difficult too. I mean, there's been trade and relationships that are built up with, countries that are perhaps not allies for over decades now. So, how are you handling it when, businesses might express an interest in investing in Canada, but when push comes to shove, they may think it's too expensive. They may not want to relocate from where they are. How are you dealing with those sorts of conversations to ensure that, they do sign on the dotted line and not just kind of, say they're behind friendshoring, but maybe not actually put it into practice?
Well, I think it's conversations like this one, except in a lot more, sort of in a lot more detail and very consistently with those partners around the world. And I think that what we are actually seeing is that we are seeing companies making choices because they are pricing in risk. If you take a look at energy security and Germany and what happened with Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, instantaneously that risk and that price of risk, not only is it a human one because of security, their energy security and their economic security being tied to that particular source. That was just very real, and I think that as companies and as investors are evaluating how they might create greater resilience, the pandemic was the other as well. We have experienced those very fractures in supply chains, and therefore it behooves on us as Canada to welcome the investment, to do everything we can to incentivize for that. I talked about batteries. Batteries is a very good example. Canada is an auto-making country, and we have a partner in the United States and Mexico where it's very, very important. And one might say, why would you mine these minerals in Canada? And will there be a price? Where there be a price consideration? Probably, absolutely. But you weigh that against a long-term resiliency, a long-term access to supply, a long-term competitiveness, and a long-term diversification in the world that actually has critical supply that can come from a democratic country like Canada. So I really do think that in all the conversations that we're having around the world, and in trying to attract partners to invest in Canada, to stand up Canadian companies to be a part of those domestic ecosystems in those supply chains. So, my job is the trade minister, but it's also the economic development minister, and that means that whether it is in chips, whether it is in batteries, whether it is in nuclear energy, whether it is in food and agri-food, which Canada is an incredible leader in, It is to support Canadian domestic companies as they are growing and building out from small and medium-sized enterprises into those value chains where we are attracting, big investments and big anchor investments like the Volkswagens, in batteries. So it really is doing the work of growing domestically into these value chains, attracting investment from the outside. And the one comment that I thought, I had so many conversations here yesterday as part of World Nuclear, but I also had it last evening at a dinner that Invest in Canada was co-hosting as part of Conférence de Paris. And so many of the companies that I talked to would say, you know what, we're absolutely looking at Canada, and I'll tell you what does it for them. They said, we're choosing Canada because of your clean energy. The fact that you are able to be a part of my solution for net zero, and because Canada has an abundance of it and we are developing more, our climate policy is environmental, our climate policy is economic policy, is security policy. That is how we look at it in Canada. And we've been working very diligently over the last 8 years under Prime Minister Trudeau's leadership. And we're going to keep doing this work for Canadians and with Canadians.
Mr. Ng, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for your time. And thank you to you all in the audience for listening.